I did my project on Forrest Gump. Um, Seen it many times. One of my favorite movies. Synopsis follows the story of Forrest Gump from boyhood to adulthood. He goes to college briefly, goes to the military, goes into business after the military. It's a sweeping fictional biopic, and he is portrayed as having below average intelligence. So that's kind of like the crux of his character. This movie was put in the intellectual disability category on the IRIS list that we had to pull from, which I wasn't surprised to find it on the list. But before I started watching it, I was kind of reflecting on Forrest's character, and I was like wondering, does he even have a disability? The only thing that's explicitly referred to during the movie is the principal's telling his mom why he can't go to regular school, saying he's below normal, and the cutoff for them to have students in the mainstream school is 80, and his IQ is measured at 75, which, according to the CDE, the adaptive skills or behavior, cognitive skills, and academic achievement scores have to be 2 or more standard deviations below the mean for this child to qualify for being intellectually having an intellectual disability. Which I don't think 75 as an IQ is 2 standard deviations below. Actually, I think that would be about 70 and under. But yeah, it's just interesting that everyone thinks he's so stupid. He doesn't even really seem to have much of a intellectual disability. Honestly, during the movie, maybe he has more like a specific learning disability, an SLD, or maybe he mostly has a speech impairment. Maybe, I don't know. I think the book that this movie was loosely based on, he doesn't necessarily have like an intellectual disability. He says like he has a hard time getting what's in his brain like into onto the paper or out of his mouth. So it could be something more specific than the kind of general broad intellectual disability category. They had a little bit of a Supercrip vibe for Forrest Gump. Pistorius is a funny choice here because he's obviously a POS, as we now know. But yeah, this continued the trend of there not being many films or TV shows or any media portrayals really at all about characters that really have no hope for like whatever full independence means. Uh, Hollywood doesn't seem to think that people want to see that. I think it's kind of what Rend and Hayes and Black, were getting at, is that there's no place on the screen for characters that don't have like a redemption arc. And Forrest Gump certainly perpetuates that because, like I mentioned on the last slide, he might not even really have much of a disability. I'm going to talk about Lieutenant Dan a little later in my learning takeaways because they address a little bit more of the stigma around disability with his character. But yeah, I don't. Basically, like they portray Forrest as being as having a disability, but he really is below average like intelligence according to like tests. So it kind of indicates like this overemphasis on like traditional measures of intelligence that we have as a society, and the fact that like until this project, I kind of had just accepted that he had a learning disability or an intellectual disability without really like kind of analyzing his strengths and everything. I think says a lot about our perceptions as a society. Like when he goes to the military, the drill sergeant's like, "You're a goddamn genius, Gump. You're goddamn gifted." He's not being sarcastic. Like, he's really successful in the military. He breaks the company record for assembling his gun the fastest. and just like his ability to just give like clear, straight, obedient answers is highly prized. So there's kind of an interesting conversation to be had there about like different types of intelligence and how our society values them. They kind of had that compensatory ability vibe that Block had mentioned in our reading, because they made Forrest like super fast. It's like that's his big gift is running, and it does feel a little bit like they're kind of compensating for whatever quote unquote cognitive like lack that he has. And that element of the movie produced some of the more cringy moments, like when the guy had to run over and give him the ball because he wasn't paying attention during the game, but then he like runs all the way down the field to the touchdown and then like keeps running through the end zone, runs over a band member and keeps running down the tunnel. Like, are we really supposed to believe that, he can later understand like all of this stuff about like military procedures? They trust him to use a gun, like all this stuff, but he isn't capable of like understanding some of the most basic elements of football, but then he's also good enough to become an All-American. I would say that was probably one of the worst components of this movie, and it kind of dims or overshadows maybe some of the positive stuff that the movie is trying to communicate. As I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure Forrest really was a character with a disability, and how severe does a learning disability or speech impairment have to be for us to label them as being an individual with a disability? Should we do that at all? Probably not. We probably shouldn't be trying to think in those black and white terms. Obviously it's important for people to be classified by official organizations or agencies so that they can be entitled to the services and accommodations that they're eligible for. I guess it's more important how they identify. Like, if a person identifies as somebody with a disability, then that's great. But I don't think that's a label that we should try to organize them into. I did appreciate that upon analyzing it, Forrest Gump didn't really like fall into any of the like 6 common constructions that Longmore was talking about. Especially they avoided the non-disabled persons supplied the solution norm, where Forrest does have some like problems or shortcomings that he faces. Like, he kind of is prone to a little bit of outbursts. They're usually justified, but he's like the agent throughout the movie. There's nobody like telling him how to be, giving him big speeches about how he should be or how he shouldn't be, or to stop feeling bad for himself. Lieutenant Dan's character would have been very easy to put in some kind of speech like that, because he loses his legs in the Vietnam War, and he really struggles to accept this new piece of his identity. He's one of his lines is, "I should have died out there with my men, but now I'm nothing but a goddamn cripple, a legless freak." So obviously they're addressing some of the social stigma around being a person with a disability, and specifically in Lieutenant Dan's case, a person with double above the knee amputations. But as he's struggling to accept himself, he's really mad. Lieutenant Dan turns to drugs and alcohol and sex, and he's a very bitter character. Forrest never gives him some sort of big speech telling him he's got to get his stuff together, trying to inspire him that he could still live a good life. Forrest just speaks to him just like he always has, and he's just super accepting, and that's kind of the character of Forrest, is kind of this sweet, ignorant cat. But Lieutenant Dan does come around eventually, but he kind of comes around just in his own good time, and I thought it was cool that the movie portrayed that as being more of this individual internal journey, rather than somebody with a disability having to have an external source of motivation and stuff. Because ultimately, I think for more people than not, it's about themselves reckoning with whatever problems or challenges they're facing. So that part I thought was pretty cool. And overall, I think the movie held up pretty well, even though the whole thing about Forrest like being quote unquote stupid. I don't know. I guess I have mixed feelings about that element, but I think overall it held up pretty good, and there wasn't like stuff that was too problematic generally. Except I don't know how we feel about Tom Hanks doing that voice. Anyway, thanks for listening. Sorry it went long. I tried. This is like my 5th recording, and I could not get it to be anywhere under 10 minutes. So I tried.